Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today for our webinar. I'm Randy Horton, Chief Solutions Officer at Orthogonal. Very briefly, for those of you who don't know, Orthogonal got into this business to improve patient outcomes faster. The way we do it is by helping medical device manufacturers and companies building medical device software accelerate the development of software as a medical device, connected device systems, and digital therapeutics. And our particular special sauce around that is by taking the best of modern software engineering and product management tools and techniques that were developed in other industries and applying them in a very thoughtful way to development under design controls for regulated software that says not just we can be lean and agile and user-centered, but still be compliant. But we believe that by fusing these methods, we can fundamentally raise the bar on how this industry looks at safety and effectiveness. So great turnout today. Glad to see so many of you people here. I know you've got busy schedules, so we don't take your time for granted. We're going to try and pack about 4+ hours of content into this webinar, really make it chock full of details for you. I think many of you know we do these monthly on different topics and trying to frequently bring in guest speakers. Today's a one where we're just doing it internally, although we've gotten a lot of input and feedback from different people in the industry about this topic. And our goal for you today is to really walk away with some really solid gold nuggets at a minimum that you can put into use right now in your own work. So the first 45-50 minutes will really be discussion. We'll be incorporating the questions that people submitted in advance. And thank you, because there were a number of them. We'll try and get to them. And then we can stay. So you could be in and out an hour, but we are, if there's more questions, we're happy to stay on up to 90 minutes to 1:30. And actually, we find that after 90 minutes, we usually still have about 40% of the audience still with us, which is fantastic. We're thrilled to answer the questions. So the bottom line is it takes a lot of work to prepare your software as a medical device for an initial launch. And I think what's true with any kind of software development is in the rush of getting something out the first time, it's frequently very easy in human nature, in a lot of ways, to not think about what's going to happen after, what's going to happen next when we want to maintain the software, improve it. And so the question is, how can we be forward-looking in approach to software that sets us up from the beginning, assuming our software is going to continue to evolve? Today's webinar is not just about that topic, but about the particular subtopic of that drills in on what does it mean when we're talking about software under design controls and software as a medical device that are regulated and have these additional sort of processes and layers and requirements around them to ensure safety and effectiveness. The great thing about software in SaMD is that it's software-based, so it's malleable. You can keep changing it, improving it, expanding what it does, maintaining it, fixing it. You know, it's a living product. The challenging thing about software in SaMD is that it's very malleable. It's the same problem. You can, just because you can evolve it doesn't mean that you're necessarily setting yourself up to do it well, and you can end up with a holy mess pretty quickly. You can launch with a ton of technical debt and really be in pretty bad shape where changes are much more slow, they're painful, they're risky. You don't have a high confidence in them. Or you end up just having at some point to sort of start throwing out things you've done and rewriting them, which can be pretty painful and not how most people want to spend their time or use up their months when they're trying to keep great forward-looking products on the market. This is a pain point in the industry. We've been hearing a lot of people talking about this lately, and frankly, it's only going to get bigger. First of all, there's more and more SaMD coming out every day, and people are going to want to maintain that. Second of all, the regulators, as we'll discuss, are really working pretty hard to give us more latitude to maintain software and to enhance things without coming back to them for every little change. Predefined change control plans with the FDA is the thing, which is great, but it also puts a burden on us in industry to figure out how do we do that well, so we have the confidence and the regulators have the confidence that we're really in control and we're not just kind of letting things, you know, as they used to say in production, oh, we're just going to slam that code in and see what happens. You know, that's not something we do. So today's webinar is about best practices. That's sort of the core of it. We could have a whole separate webinar about change management. So today we're going to talk about what good looks like and sort of things to think about in best practices to set up so that when you are creating your SaMD, you're designing it for ongoing evolution. And then when you're evolving it ongoing, what kinds of things you want to do. how you modify your organization and get all the different components and groups in your organization aligned to do that is a great topic. But when we were prepping for this, the more we got into it, the more it became clear it's an entirely different topic. So we may touch on it a little bit, but if there's interest, we can come back and say, how do you get your organization to do these things? Because a lot of these are very different behaviors. Today joining us is Orthogonal CEO and founder, Bernhard Kappe. We'll start, Bernhard, with some simple questions. By the way, to the audience, please send in your questions throughout. We'd love to hear your questions. Also, the extent to which you're comfortable sharing them, and you can anonymize them or say, I heard about somebody else. We'd love to hear about your software maintenance and enhancement horror stories. What can go wrong? What have you seen? What have you heard about? We won't name anybody. And, like I said, you can generalize it. I heard about somebody else's company that had that. But we'd love to hear the challenges that people have seen with this. So Bernhard, let's start this out simple. As Simon Sinek says, let's start with why. Why do you want to evolve SaMD? What are the different use cases that would lead you to want to have version 1.1, 1.2, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? I don't know if we're far enough along that there's a lot of version 6 SaMD out there, but
I think there are enough of them. If we just step back, right, and those of you who have heard me before, I say this an awful lot. Harking back to Mark Andreessen's Wall Street Journal article from 2011, software is eating the world, and every company will eventually have to become a software company. That was from 2011. It's played out, and you can see it throughout all of these other industries that have been disrupted. And the same thing has been happening in the medical device space, but more slowly, faster in some areas than in others, but it's happening everywhere. Faster in diabetes, faster in sort of outside of the hospital monitoring, but it's gone into the surgical suite, et cetera. Software is more and more important. And with software, you can create value faster. You can evolve the software faster. You can build an ecosystem around your products, whether that's an insulin pump, a CGM, and all kinds of software for patients, clinicians, et cetera, around that, or surgical planning, surgical robotics. All of these things are getting more and more connected. And when you have an ecosystem, the ecosystem makes the individual parts more valuable, more powerful. It magnifies the impact of a change in an update. And it's a lot easier to update software than it is to update hardware. So that multiplier effect is really important, especially, in established markets where you're not coming out with the first thing that no one else has, and there isn't really a market and there aren't competitors. But most times, as soon as you get your first product out, you're probably not the only people working on it, or you are in an existing ecosystem. And so, the ability to move faster in that kind of environment is important. If it's software, you can move faster. Someone will do it. It might as well be you in terms of that, right? So I think that's the biggest thing. The challenge there is, can you move faster, as we say, without breaking things, right? While improving quality, improving outcomes, improving user experience, while maintaining regulatory compliance where needed, and certainly patient safety at the same time. That's the challenge, right? But the nature of this is it's inevitable. So you might as well deal with it.
So to somebody who would quote back to you the old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You think the time has passed for that?
I mean, it really depends on where you are and the sort of nature of competition in your particular part of the market, right? There are there are things that are very slow, very expensive. The competition isn't there. The rewards aren't there for moving faster and for changing things. So uh, that means you may not need to invest the same amount as someone in an area that is moving a lot faster, where the competition basis of competition is different. What I can say is this is happening everywhere, not at equal speed. And if you don't consider it, then you're, and it's not part of your strategy, then you will probably get disrupted at some point, and probably before you know it.
So maybe let's talk for a minute before we get into the best practices of how to do this. Let's talk about the impact and pain that's caused if you don't plan this well. What are the penalties to an organization that develops software without an eye towards future maintenance and future enhancement?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of them, right? There is one approach where you end up getting sloppy and you rush things out without proper controls, in which case, there are definitely, you're in trouble with the FDA in cases like that, right? That happens if you don't have things dealt with properly and you're just trying to go cowboy, shall we say, right? And that happens with some startups and even large companies because of pressures, but without the right tools in hand. That's one area. The other one is if you're not actually designing for change and for those updates, you end up being much slower and not being able to get changes out quickly, right? And so again, you have a slower feedback loop than your competitors do, and frankly, when you're doing SaMD, right, you're also very often leveraging generalized computing technologies. You're integrating potentially with other products, whether those are medical device product or not products, and all of those are changing and moving quickly. Not to mention the cybersecurity implications, where you have to respond to threats in your connected ecosystem in a rapid fashion.
So basically, to summarize, you're spending more to get less, taking longer, potentially falling behind, and you have lower confidence in kind of the quality potentially of what's going on, or it's going to take you a lot more to get equivalent confidence that you are still functioning properly, are secure, all of those things.
Yeah, and I mean you have greater sort of regulatory and compliance risk as well, right?
So as the line goes, other than that, how did you like the play, Mrs. Lincoln?
That's right.
And the one last point I'll add to this, which I think is not insignificant, is it is degrading to the morale of a team if they are not in an environment where it's easy, not easy, but just you can constantly be updating, moving. The more that it kind of feels like I'm stuck maintaining a legacy piece of software that's got a lot of overhead, you'll start to lose certain people that you want. Whereas if you've got a team that's clicking and going and really continually, getting better, you're going to keep a higher caliber team together. And if a lot of your expertise is wrapped up in the knowledge of those people, that's not an insignificant deal. Okay, so what makes this any different when we're talking about software under design controls? Why is SaMD maintenance and enhancement any different than social media, payroll systems?
I mean, obviously, patient risk is the biggest thing, right? When you are making changes, something could break, and that could hurt a patient. That's certainly why we have the regulations that we do. And the other part of that is then within those regulations, there are things we need to comply with, quality systems regulations, risk management, all of these types of things. And then we need to provide documentation for and evidence that we are following a process that meets the guidance and the regulations, right? So those are the things that we have to deal with here, that are different, right? I mean, you could say there are impacts certainly of something not working well, not meeting you know uh, the needs of the end user, et cetera, outside of the medical device. And those are typically bad things if your software is buggy and doesn't work, but it doesn't have the same kind of impact and, frankly, impact on lives and on legal jeopardy, et cetera, for you if you don't meet those regulations and you don't keep patient safety foremost in your mind.
All right. So let's get into it. Best practices. I know you have a long suite. I don't know if you want to organize it into some high level buckets or just dive into some detail, but lay it
Yeah,
on.
maybe. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways of looking at it, but let's start with kind of just functionally. I look at it as sort of two buckets. The first bucket is really getting feedback faster, right? What is it that you can do to get feedback faster from the market, from end users, clinical outcomes, et cetera? All of these things that you can then use to potentially evolve your product, right? And then the other part is being able to take that, process it, and make changes and get those changes through safely and quickly. So there's a kind of two separate areas that interrelate
So
if you
would
want to get the full feedback loop going.
So would it be fair to find those that you're dividing into two buckets? Best practices for building the right product, and then best practices for building the product right.
I'm not sure I would actually put it that way. I think, building the right product and is part of it. I think one is it's really simple. It's inputs and outputs, right? So are we getting the right inputs? Are we getting them quickly and making the right decisions based on that? Are we getting the right outputs? And can we speed the process up and get better and more inputs and get them faster, and then be able to get outputs faster, have a faster feedback loop as part of it? That's really it.
Okay.
So
let's start with inputs. Best
let's start
practices on inputs.
let's start with the input. So there are things you can do before as you're developing version 1 or whenever you start, right? Thinking about what is the nature of the inputs that you could be getting. Some of them are simply, again, if we borrow from areas outside of medical device, getting feedback from users early and often. So things like 3-user Thursdays, right? Where no matter what, I've got 3 users I'm talking to and getting feedback from in some fashion once a week or every other week. And that is a constant process throughout development and post-market as well, right? That's something we do outside of the medical device space. It can be used to pull in not just user experience, feedback on what features are resonating, what matters to them, but also human factors, use errors, et cetera. We can get that feedback in there as well. And then once we're out in the market, we can we add in things like product analytics, where we are actually measuring user behavior and getting that information as part of feedback from the field. So we have really good data on what is happening, and it's how it's being used, and then that gets fed back into 3-user Thursdays. That is how you end up having sort of the best practice outside of the medical device space of 3-user Thursdays, fast feedback, test, get feedback, and you weave in human factors, use errors, patient risk as part of that process, right? That's one example. There, another one would be sort of thinking about what other kind of data and information could you collect along the way? Is there a way of collecting outcomes data or other interim data that that you can use for things like clinical outcomes, right? Because it's software, there's a lot you can collect. There's a lot you can connect in there, and so being intentional about that as part of your design process and your evolution process as well is important. Sometimes that's cheap and easy to get. Sometimes there's costs involved in that. Um, I think a great example there of someone who's done a great job of that is Edwards Life Sciences around the whole TAVR system, where really a lot of the process, a lot of their what they did around that was really investing in collecting lots of data. It wasn't cheap, but they did the health economics and and the analysis and said, "Yep, it's worth doing this," and that's proven to be very effective for them in terms of their ability to get FDA clearance and additional indications, and then pushing that all the way through to additional reimbursement from CMS in very short order.
And
Right.
to be clear, that's actually a, so to speak, an analog case study, not a digital case study, because the device itself was not a digital product, although presumably they use digital technologies, but they got really, really good, to confirm what you're saying, at collecting all this data to let them continually prove that the device could be used for more and more indications.
They actually had a bunch of digital companion software, et cetera, that they use. So as again, you're building out an ecosystem. When you build out an ecosystem, some of that ecosystem may be medical device, some of it may not be medical device, but all of it is an opportunity for you to collect additional information. In some cases, really cheaply. In other cases, there are additional things that that you need to do that are not inexpensive, but that may be worth it. But they absolutely did all of the above in this case.
Got it.
So
I'll refer everybody to a prior webinar we had on integrated evidence a couple months ago, which went into that particular topic in a lot of depth. Okay, so that's the inputs. Tell us about the outputs. What what do
yeah,
you need to have in place to consistently get good, reliable, quality, cheap, effective, right?
I've got one more input actually before, which is, again, there is all kinds of instrumentation you can do around software that is connected, et cetera. So all of the monitoring you can do, cybersecurity monitoring, performance monitoring, all of that kind of stuff, reliability, all of these this is also feedback and input that you can use uh, as part of this, and that you can feed either into specific systems that help you answer questions around that, but also into your big data lake that you use for all kinds of potential analysis, right? So lots of opportunities in the digital space for collecting information for everything throughout the product life cycle, right? Um, so then the question is, the things on the other side, uh, the outputs. How do you turn that into outputs? And that is like there's a whole bunch of things that are a part of that, right? Again, if we look at that user experience, human factors work, pretty easy to see that when you're doing 3 user Thursdays, not only are you trying to find out why someone is doing something, but when you have updates, you're going out and testing those with end users, new designs, new features, et cetera, qualitatively before you get those out, quantitatively, right? Um, the other thing that as you come up with new features or updates or et cetera, um, there are things you need to assess in terms of what is the regulatory implication of this? What is the do I need to file a new 510K? Do I need to do validation? Do I need to do verification? How are we managing all of this, right? And so a lot of pieces to that that are all complementary to each other, but one of them is certainly, as you are thinking about your ecosystem, understand what parts of it are a medical device, what parts are not a medical device, and things like, the FDA's multiple function guidance for the US market, at least, is very helpful there, as are things like IEC 62304 and software segregation that help you in terms of saying, okay, this we're going to have to this is part of the medical device, this is not the part of the a part of the medical device. We have more freedom in terms of working through those things without having to potentially do a 510K or whatever for this, because it's not a medical device, or it's a low risk part of a medical device that we have prescribed. And then other things around that you can do are things like predetermined change control plans, which, again, it's the guidance that is out there in force now is very much around AI. But as we know, the mandate for in the Fedora from late 2022 now was not purely for AI, it was for all kinds of software changes. And in fact, lots of people have used that guidance to have predetermined change control plans for not just AI things, but for software in general. So that, again, those are things that you can use to sort of figure out what makes sense in terms of the regulatory uh, uh, approach, when you need to file, when you don't need to file, and that can certainly speed up your response um, for SaMD or SIMD for that matter, right? So that's one piece that you can leverage. I think really, focusing on kind of good how would I put it? Good modularity and good software development practices goes a long way along this as well. If you think about it, if you have software that's developed in a modular way, if you have orthogonality between different subsystems, real clarity and risk management around interfaces between different systems and subsystems, residual risk, failure modes, all of those types of things make your system more resilient and easier to make changes and to automate the process of testing and verifying and validating that these changes actually are low risk, right? So it's modularity plus really good testing practices, testing coverage that help a lot. And then things like design controls, automation, really thinking about the full trace all the way from user needs to requirements to, let's call them, user stories, to acceptance criteria, testing, architecture, all the way through DevOps. If you can have that digital trace all the way through, you can speed that entire process of getting your software out dramatically.
So I think one of the things you're sort of implying here, I wanted to confirm, is if you have good modularity and architecture, and those things are aligned with risk and regulatory analysis and failure analysis and all of those things, if you've laid that good architectural blueprint, you're essentially giving your team a lot less of an opportunity in the future to get out over their skis and make mistakes because they're sort of working from a really good foundation in the first place. Whereas if you've got things that are really messy, it's probably harder for a team to keep on top of all this stuff and really know what's an impact in that.
I think that's true. I think you're sort of providing the scaffolding for them, so they could still make mistakes, but you find out the results of those mistakes, and they're more bounded, right? And you find them out earlier in the process, right?
And the
Yeah.
best example for the non-technologists on the call who are business people that I can give is if you've ever had a house with electrical wiring and you needed to make a change in that wiring, it turns out that the quality that the wiring and the labeling of the wiring in the switch box were done has a huge impact on the electrician and how comfortable they can be saying, I know this wire only goes here and not somewhere else. And when I change this electrical thing, it'll change this and not that. Or you can plug this really big device like a Tesla charger in here safely and know you're not gonna, bring things down, with the risks, of course, being outages and in worst case fires, right? Shorting, losing fire. But it all depends on, is your box neatly organized and labeled? Which,
Right.
by the way, my personal recommendation, don't buy a house until they give you that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that makes sense, right? Um, and so the more you can kind of embed good decisions and good practices in your process and your tools and technology, the more you have that kind of scaffolding, the better off you are, right?
Yeah. So some specific issues that come out of this from the discussion I want to hone in on. One is, and I think you've gotten to some of this, but if you could talk in a little more detail about what does good look like in terms of documentation, well-managed code, documented architectures, things that have to be manually documented in parallel with systems as opposed to sort of well-designed metadata or things that self-architected. How do you do all that to make it easier to keep maintaining that stuff?
Yeah, so I think, the challenge is sort of what's good versus what's good enough, right? And this really is going to depend very much, right? You can't you the way to look at it is really be clear what kind of frequency of change and what's the nature of change that you're expecting. How much of this is uh you know super hardware dependent? Nothing new is going to come out until you have your capital equipment out, versus something that is in a market where no, people are expecting changes more quickly, you can get feedback more quickly, etc. The more it is the latter and you don't have those same constraints, the more potential benefit there is to these faster feedback loops. And then it's a question of actually, I would go back to the metrics, right? What is it that you are trying to optimize? Are you trying to get things out faster, more efficiently, etc.? There's a whole bunch of levers you could pull that are complementary, but it is about sort of, what is the biggest best thing you can do, the lowest hanging fruit, right? And so that's kind of model it, right? One way to do it is to sort of, at least do the thought exercise of, I'm going to make a change uh to something in my software, one small change. Let's say I'm changing a letter on a or a color or something like that in a screen, right? What has to happen in order for that to go through? How much time and effort is involved in doing that, right? Um, and and that will tell you kind of where, that's one exercise where you can see how efficient is my process, and then you can say, okay, what changes could I make for that to get that more efficient? you could have a larger chunk of change of software. Let's say, oh, it is a new feature. If I am going to do a release with a new feature, what's it going to take to go through that? And then you can see what parts of those processes make the most sense to actually do, right? Sometimes, one of the big issues is how quickly do you make decisions? Who has to be involved in reviewing documentation, in approving things, etc. Is your process around that designed for fast changes and for frequently doing this, or is it designed for a release that's going to come every 6 months or a year? Those are very different ways of organizing it, et cetera. So that's one part, right? If that is slow, and then that may be your kind of biggest gating factor, as opposed to we can automate everything and we can automate the documentation. But if our decision making is slow and involves lots of people who are not in the core of the team, it could be, it doesn't matter how fast that other stuff is. If you can't get something out, you're investing in the wrong thing first. At some point, those other things, the automation, et cetera, become more valuable when you can make decisions faster.
So let's talk about two interrelated challenges, which I don't think are at all SaMD specific. I think this is just software enhancement maintenance, which is one, if you're not constantly working on all parts of your software at all times, you start to lose the team that has the knowledge around that, right? People move on to other things, people roll off, people forget what they've got. The other challenge with that is that once you've released software, generally you essentially start to accrue legacy at some point. Newer versions of things come out, software, technologies themselves become obsolete, or certain architectures become older or inflexible. And now you've got to maintain knowledge on things that nobody's learning anyway because they're old, right? If somebody else knows this thing, they're going to probably know the newer one. So how do you, in a medical device team context, keep that knowledge together and maintain that ability to maintain older stuff? It's not necessarily bad, it's just older.
Yeah.
If anything,
Yeah.
the longer it lasts, the more it's a workhorse. You've gotten
Yeah.
your money's worth. But
I mean, look, there is no perfect solution for this. There's no silver bullet. There are just things you can do to make it less painful and better, right? So I would say, if one of the things I would say is all of those things, like, automated design controls, good documentation, good linking, using the tooling to build it right and to articulate what it is, not just the requirements, but the specifications and the tests and the automation of that in, human readable form. Uh, all of that stuff makes it easier for you working in a complex system where you don't understand all of the parts of it, but you can test your way through that, right? And so that, if you set it up that way, it's a lot easier to maintain software and to update software. We run across this sometimes where something has been built by someone, we have to go and remediate it. And sometimes that software remediation and taking over, you know, existing code and existing requirements, et cetera. If that stuff is all well defined and uh well tested and automated around the testing, chances are you're not going to have to do that much remediation anyway, or taking over is certainly a lot easier. That is a lot less painful, because when something breaks, or when you change something, what else breaks. And when you add or update new requirements, what the impact is within the system. That's where doing that the right way with the right tooling makes life so much easier. So that's one benefit there. I think the other thing is really, again, if you're if you can do this with agile teams, and you actually kind of do things like pairing around things, and the term promiscuous pairing in agile, uh where you rotate people through the development process, helps as well, right? Um, but the more something is like, it's not really changing, it's not, a current evolving product, but it is something that's really kind of, it's out there in the market and we aren't doing that much, and the more complex that is, the harder it is, right? Um, I mean, the thing in SaMD and connected device systems is there may be pieces of of the ecosystem that are not evolving that quickly, but there are others that continue to evolve quickly. If you have good documentation, good instrumentation, good testing of all the pieces of your ecosystem, you'll know, you know, you'll know when it breaks, and you can figure out how it works as well.
Excellent. So one additional point I will add, which has been a mantra of mine for a long time, I guess, which is that I generally believe that one of the best ways to onboard junior staff into an organization is by starting them on a production support and enhancement team for an existing system, preferably one that was well built in the first place, that has maintained good processes. Because you start by seeing how things look when they're done well, and you learn very quickly what the challenges are when they aren't done well. So that those are things that when you start to then develop net new greenfield systems, you won't make those mistakes because you have sympathy for what's downstream, and a greater appreciation. You essentially become sort of the user of your own software as opposed to just the creator of it. It may not be the most exciting thing, but it's a really solid way to train people. And it's also, frankly, I found sometimes a really solid way to also support more experienced staff who are maybe sometimes looking for a little less craziness. They're at a juncture in their life where, I've got a new kid. I wouldn't mind not working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And lets them focus on the mentorship more. We have a ton of questions here that I want to start getting to, because I do want to be mindful. We don't have to stop at 12:50, but we are coming up on 12:50 Eastern time. A lot of great questions. So one is a couple people honed in on post-market monitoring strategies and safety signals in post-market. So how do you look at that as part of this maintenance and enhancement, although sometimes it could just be fixing, right? You're finding problems that you launched with and didn't know, as opposed to new stuff. But how do you look at that stuff in a digital SaMD world?
Yeah, and so I would say, you know, when you're doing your initial design and development, right, you're looking at things like critical task and critical task analysis. You're doing design FMEAs, use FMEAs, all kinds of different things as part of that, and you were designing for, hopefully getting as much data as you can to continue to evaluate your product, right? So if you do that, and as you're doing your risk management, you're thinking about, how am I going to be able to monitor this information? I'm making decisions. I'm probably making educated guesses on, on what the actual sort of risks are, et cetera. The question is, how can I then, when I'm in market, collect information around those things? How can I tell whether this is happening or not? And how can I tell whether my mitigations are working, right? So instrumenting your system for that is important, right? So, if, for example, your product analytics can be quite valuable. If one of the things that you know that could happen is a use error of some kind, right? Can you detect that use error as through user behavior, right? Well, if that's the case, you can see if your mitigations in practice are actually helping mitigate those use errors. They're supposed to do X after Y, and for some reason they're not doing X after Y, or they're doing Y incorrectly. You can tell if that's happening, not just qualitatively, but you can tell that quantitatively. And then you can use that to investigate and improve, right? I think the same goes for all kinds of, you know, different things. If you're instrumenting and collecting the data appropriately, you can use that to then inform in a much better way your risk management for future versions of the product, right? In a lot of cases, if all you have is complaints, and those complaints aren't really don't have a whole lot of context and a lot of sort of details. That's not that's the old school way, pre-digital way of doing it, but we can actually instrument an actual SaMD system in a way to know a lot more of what's going on inside of it and with the use of it. And if we have a good way of sort of tying that to outcomes, and we can invest in collecting, you know, other signals, then that can help dramatically in terms of what we're doing.
Couple questions related to how do you do PCCP in this context?
Mhm.
And to clarify for those who don't know, PCCP, predefined change control plans, is essentially the FDA's way of saying, we are open to you doing more updates to your software without having to come back to us to refile. You still have to document it. And the way you will do that is when we first approve your software, we will agree on the guardrails of what you would be allowed to change on your own and how you would be allowed to change it under what circumstances. And if we agree, you'll stay within those guardrails and document. You don't have to come back to us every time. So people are saying, how do you do that, both for AI and non-AI? And what kind of details, how detailed do you need to go in terms of, validating that?
Yeah, and so it's I will say it's early days, and the way these things happen as you kind of come up with new regulations, we're going to end up with all kinds of edge cases where it's like, oh, I didn't think about that, and how do you deal with those things? And people are going to push the boundaries of the envelope, etc. So what I will say is, it is not a make any change you want environment. It is really think of it as a modest expansion of the existing um, software changes, and when you have to file and when you don't have to change for software changes, right? So you already have that. We already know that for non-device portions of a system, we don't necessarily have to file for changes, but for the device parts, normally we would have to follow that guidance for when you would have to. I think what this what it ends up being here um is again sort of, where is how much patient risk is there in the change? How well do you mitigate those? And how much are you changing the system, right? Are you changing the intended use? Are you changing in a significant way? Are you changing indications for use? Are you changing who the users or the subject of your software are? Those are all things that are probably kind of outside of the bounds of something, right? But AI is easier in that regard, and any algorithm, frankly, is if what you're saying is, I am making this thing 5% more accurate or something like that. I'm not going to claim necessarily that you know, this is no longer a screening device. This is now a diagnostic. That would lead to, that is probably outside of the bounds of a PCCP, but it's a more accurate screening device. And here is how we are managing all the risk, and here's how we're dealing with all the subpopulations, all the kinds of questions that you might have. Those are, that would be the type of thing you could do more easily. Certainly, you could use this if you wanted to. I'm not sure you necessarily need to. For making changes to the low risk parts or no risk parts of your device, right? Where you say we're going to change these, we're going to we're going to provide better alerts for people, give them more choice. We're going to do those types of things, and you can demonstrate that these are not things that would uh, change the patient risk or put you in a different category. Those are the types of things you can do. You have to. It's very much down to the specifics of what you're doing. But I would start with thinking about the types of changes you can anticipate, what you're going to, and those changes are going to be, the things you can anticipate are probably things you can anticipate based on feedback, and then look at it, look at the risk, look at the features, et cetera, to see where that would be. So
We are at 12:53, so we don't need to stop. We've got some more questions, but we're going to start losing some people who have to move on. So I want to thank everybody who has attended, and he needs to drop off now. On behalf of myself and Bernhard and Melissa Gill, who had a last minute client emergency that came up, and they do happen to everybody, that she had to manage too. Thank you for coming. We will be putting out very shortly the date for our late May webinar, which is going to be on the topic of essentially what's it going to take to start using generative AI inside medical devices. The personal position of our firm is we're not super close at this point. Generative AI is probably still pretty new, and we're a long ways from being able to understand exactly how we're going to be able to use it in devices. But the question that we want to explore is what's going to be the maturation process that gets us there, and what should we be all looking for? Because I think everybody's very eager to see when and how that might be able to happen. Okay, so a couple quick questions. Here's a really interesting one that somebody notes, which is when you're doing cloud-based distribution updates of software, web services, web interfaces, as the manufacturer, you control when things go live. You're ready, you hit go, the date and time you're choosing. But if you're going through an app store, you're no longer really the master of your own destiny to some extent. You've now got another gatekeeper or two in front of you for getting something out. So how do you take that into account with SaMD of digital distribution when there's an additional gatekeeper who has to prove and flip the switch for you on your software for apps?
yeah, I think there's again, it's a risk-based approach. What could go wrong, and how and what's the impact of that in the case of something like, I think the case you're referring to is kind of BYOD, right, where your software is sitting on a patient phone or a physician phone, or et cetera. It's not under your mobile device management solution. It's not a device you control. It's theirs. They just download it. And then whenever they or Apple or whoever decides to update the operating system, then yeah.
The operating system, or to release to say, okay, Apple determines when your new version of your app can get released. To some extent, they still
Well,
have a mechanism on.
sure, to some extent, right? And so I think, again, look at how your software is being used and what's the impact of either it not working in a certain way or the impact of it not being available, right? The impact of your app is unavailable. Frankly, anytime you are doing something that is, even if you control the phone, It's possible that your app may not be available because you don't have good connectivity, because various other things might happen, right? So that's something that you should really consider the impact of those things in the and whether this is something that should be on a mobile phone, right? Controlling a defibrillator from a mobile phone in real time may be a fine thing and a convenient thing, but if it doesn't work, you better have a backup to that, right? So then I think the other part of that then is, so once you have kind of understood what your risks are and what happens if it fails, et cetera, and which of those are acceptable, then you can have kind of a layered approach to how you do things. You could, in certain circumstances, say only approved hardware, only approved operating system versions, et cetera, can happen. That certainly, the higher risk it is, the better and you that would need to be. But then you can do a lot in terms of, again, monitoring when you're out in the field. That product analytics isn't just for improving your product. It's actually also, how is it, what's happening in the real world right now, who is having problems. Those are things you can see, and you can see, oh, there was an OS version update, there was a new Samsung phone that came out, or what have you, some combination, and targeting exactly where those issues are. The other part is, in terms of being able to do kind of the right level of testing. If you can automate a lot of the testing, and you can use things like device farms for doing the testing, doing testing quickly across a lot of things to see what could be happening or what might be coming up with beta releases, with new smartphones, et cetera, is a lot easier, and faster. Difficult if you're doing something like a Bluetooth connected device, where that Bluetooth connectivity isn't necessarily something that you can test in a device farm. But something you could do in that case would be kind of like the concept of field level self-validation. New OS version, new hardware. Have we tested this before? Before you allow a user to use it, you have sort of self-validation scripts that are running in the field, and then based on the output of that, something gets put on the allow list or block list, and appropriate messaging to the end user. Those are all in your bag of tricks that you could apply, just depending on how high the risk is, and which of those strategies you need to employ.
Got a lot of questions, but I think we've covered a number of them in different ways. So without beating a horse to death, I'm just looking for more big topics to cover. I think the last big interesting question that comes in here that's different is, I guess this isn't just about post-launch. That can be it's a pre-launch challenge too, but also post-launches. I sort of describe it as there's an impedance mismatch between how easy it is to test and make changes to the user interface, and how much flexibility we have to do that in terms of regulatory requirements, clinical trials, lockdown, those kinds of things. So how do
Yeah.
you look at that on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, and so I would say there are a couple of things here that you can look at, and again, it depends on how important it is to be able to do this kind of testing, and for what type of thing. In a lot of SaMD cases, a lot of the testing that you might want to do is for things that are outside of the bounds of the medical device. And so if you have done a good job of following the multiple function device guidance, you have demonstrated that say using segregation, changes in one do not impact changes in some other part of the system, then you have at least theoretical freedom to make changes to those parts of your system that are not not the medical device, and you could do things like A/B testing, et cetera, in those. I would say most medical device companies don't feel super comfortable with that, but it is certainly a legitimate process, and it can certainly be done. I think the other thing that you can do fairly simply is just canary testing, right? And so the idea of canary testing, and it's a best practice everywhere, is after you have software that is releasable, a new release of software, whether that is a new 510K or a new release that is where you don't have to do a filing, rather than doing a sort of A/B test where you are release or multivariate test where you're releasing different versions concurrently into the market. What you're doing is taking that new version and releasing that to a limited number of users, right? And if you release that to a limited number of users while having the existing software out there, you're doing two things. You're like it's a good software practice to do that limited release, and then if it's working well and there are no problems, releasing it out to a larger group. But the other thing that gets you is to be able to do analysis of your cohorts, the canary group and the existing one. So you're kind of de facto doing A/B testing of what is the effectiveness of the new version compared to the old version, right?
Just for the limited subset.
If you want to do something within a clinical trial, I think that is a big, hairy subject. And I think there are things that you can do and that people have done. Tide Pool, I think, has done some very interesting things in terms of sort of permanent beta and things within their IRB, but you probably need to have a really good IRB, and that's a whole different subject, which I'd love to get into at some point, because it's one of the other areas I think in the medical space in general and in medical devices that is super inefficient right now, is how that whole thing works.
Okay, but topic for another day.
Definitely.
And one last kind of interesting question, which I love this one. What are your thoughts regarding solutions that are under enforcement discretion classification? What sort of risk strategy would be best for SaMD enhancement when it is low risk at the get-go? And I would add, but may not stay low risk.
Right. Yeah. So I think ultimately, right, what does enforcement discretion say? Enforcement discretion says that it's low risk, but it's still a medical device. And so you still have to do all the things you would normally do in terms of risk management, in terms of documentation, in terms of following good practices within your quality management system to keep the patient safe, to deal with efficacy, to do post-market monitoring. The only thing that is different, I would argue, is that you don't have to go to the FDA and do a regulatory filing, right? And you don't have to wait 90 days, 180 days, whatever back and forth there is, in order to get your changes into the market. But you are still open to inspection, and you better be buttoned up for that and be doing the right things. That's really the only difference is the regulatory filing. So you still have to do that. You still have to, have a good quality management system. All of the benefits of actually, having good fast feedback loops, automation, design controls, feedback from the market are even more important in a case like this, because you don't have that that 90 to 180 days for a 510K, right?
Thank you. Well, thank you to our audience and everybody who's hung in here past the 1 hour mark. Thanks, Bernhard. We are always looking for feedback on the good, the bad, and the ugly. What was useful to this, and what was not? What should we do different? What should we keep doing? And also for new topics. So please be in touch. We love hearing from people. And we hope to see you at the end of May to discuss what's it going to take to put generative AI inside medical devices. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.